What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this Saturday video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living on a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. Also, make sure you check out our presenting sponsor, Profit X. Profit X is the future of sports wagering here in America. You're not betting against a sports book. You're betting against your peers, and you're creating the best lines in the business. You can trade now on a platform that's available in 40 states where you set your odds and accept ones available set by other people. Recently, over the last several days, I bet various games where on Profit X, I got a nearly 10-cent better price than any other gambling site out there. So make sure in the pinned comment, you click the link and jump aboard Profit X. It is the future and first sports prediction exchange here in America. Pin comment now. Use my promo code Jeff Nadu and get plenty of perks and bonuses. Profit X, the best odds in the U.S. What's up, everybody, and welcome in. It's been a week since my last video, and I'm here with another great organized crime video. And I'm asked all the time, what is my favorite crime family to talk about? Well, when it comes to research and having interests, it's always been the Bonanno Crime Family. We've interviewed all sorts of people from that family over the years, whether they were associates like Frank Fiordolino or made members like Peter Lavaglio. One of the most interesting parts of the Bonanno Crime Family is their very large Sicilian faction. And one of those people is one of the more interesting. The story of Cesare Bonventre next on the Sit Down. Now, I understand the Sicilian pronunciation is Cesare. However, for the sake of this video, I'm going to use the American pronunciation, Caesar. Cesare Bonventre was born on January 1st, 1951, in the picturesque and beautiful Castellammare del Golfo, which is in Sicily, one of the most beautiful cities really in the Mediterranean and in Italy. One thing we know about that area, it is rife with the Sicilian Mafia. Now, when we look into people from Castellammare del Golfo, most notably people like Carmine Galante, or really anybody from that general vicinity or in Sicily, the blood goes way back, right? I mean, Castellammare del Golfo is a pretty small place in terms of population, and most of the people you would find distantly are related. When it comes to Cesare Bonventre, to first understand kind of his bloodlines, you actually have to go to his great uncle, a person called Vito the King Bonventre. Now, according to the terrific book, The Origin of Organized Crime in America by David Critchley, Vito Bonventre was born way back in 1875 in Castellammare del Golfo. Now, I found this terrific, and I have to say terrific, chart. Now, this comes from a person called, I got to get the name here, McCool Warren, I believe, on Reddit. He has his own Reddit forum, essentially, and he put together this, and I'll link it in the description of this video. He put together this very interesting familial chart, ancestral chart, notifying like who is related to who. Now, there is a Vito Bonventre who was actually related to Joe Bonanno distantly. That said, in speaking to people like Frank Fiordolino, he would tell me that it was common knowledge that in Castellammare del Golfo, there were multiple Bonventre groups. And if we look on the far left, we'll notice Vito the King Bonventre, as well as Antonino Bonventre. Now, Vito the King had a brother, Antonino. He would marry a woman called Maria Valenti. They would have a son called Gaspare Bonventre, who would have a son called Cesare Bonventre. So obviously, Vito the King was Cesare Bonventre's great uncle. Now, I do want to go into a little bit about Bonventre because he's actually an interesting guy. He's your Mustache Pete, if you will. He would come to America around the turn of the century. And from what I understand, around 1905. And he would settle in, which many did during those days, in Brooklyn, as far as Sicilians. And he was a part of a crew headed by a man called Niccolo Schiro, who would eventually become the boss of what we know as the modern day Bonanno Crime Family. Schiro was said to be in power of a powerful Sicilian crew between 1912 and 1930. However, during the around 1930 kind of upheaval in the mafia between Masseria and all these different people, Nicola Schiro would actually flee and go back to Italy. That would head way to Maranzano, who's eventually taken out, and so on. And down the road, Joe Bonanno, who was also distantly related to these people, he would become the boss of the modern day Bonanno Crime Family. Now, Vito Bonventre was a very rich man. He was a huge earner, and that gave him the name the King. It was said that he made a lot of his wealth as a bootlegger in the 20s and was also a feared killer. He also held a very normal job as the owner of a bakery and a garage in Brooklyn. It's also been well received that he was part of a group called the Good Killers. And we can see he is circled here when he was arrested in the early 20s. Now, notice on the far left, there's a man with a bandage covering his left eye. That is actually Stefano Magaddino. It was said that the Good Killers were suspects in nearly 20 bodies. And eventually in 1921, the group was arrested. However, the main witness, his testimony completely dissolved, and they were all freed. What's interesting about Vito Bonventre is he wouldn't last much longer. In 1930, he was shot multiple times by two men running from the scene in the area of Orient Avenue in Brooklyn. If you notice, the newspaper article from the Brooklyn Eagle would state that he was a retired baker known as the King because of his reputed wealth and said by police to be a member of the mafia. Now, if you want to look into Vito Bonventre, I'd obviously recommend you do that. Maybe I'll do a video on him and the Good Killers at some point. However, let's get back to Cesare Bonventre. I just want to kind of give you a little history as far as him. Now, you may be asking, what was his father's role, Gaspare Bonventre, in the life? Well, according to what I know, it's likely that he was an associate and connected to the mafia in Sicily. It's unclear, as far as to me, whether he ever came over to America. Some stayed in Sicily, some came over. Now, we don't have the exact date that Cesare Bonventre came into America, but being born in 1951, we would venture to believe it was in the 60s, due in large part to the fact that, according to the Social Security Administration and some of the research that I made, an issued Social Security number for Cesare Bonventre would pop up in either 1968 or 1969. So we have to think that in his late teens or early 20s, he would head over, most likely his late teens, to America. Now, it has also been widely reported that Cesare Bonventre may even already have been a made member of the mafia in Sicily before he came here. But due to the fact that he came here, he had to get reinitiated, which would come down the road. And he would settle, like many Sicilians, in Brooklyn. As if you look back to his great uncle actually lived in Williamsburg, and eventually so did Cesare Bonventre. He would slot in with an old pal of his and said to be cousin, of course, Baldassare Amato. They were both experienced, well-liked, and slotted in perfectly in the Sicilian faction of the Bonanno Crime Family. Now, remember, by the 70s into the mid-70s, the reputed leader of the Bonanno Crime Family was Carmine Galanti. And we all know that if you know anything about him, he's actually from Castellammare del Golfo as well. So I think it worked perfectly in hiring both Amato and Bonventre as his bodyguards. They were young, they were up and coming. And, you know, I'm going to reference this later in the video, but when you look into Amato and Bonventre, obviously they were Sicilian, but outside of that, they have a striking similarity to someone like Sal Vitale, who acted as a bodyguard, was well-liked, was respected, probably a long future in the family. And like Sal Vitale, a very similar fate would come to Bonventre, which we'll obviously get into. Now, I'm not going to go through the murder of Galanti here in a second, but before we do that, I do want to talk about the making ceremony held by Carmine Galanti, where both Baldo Amato and Cesare Bonventre are initiated into the Bonanno crime family. It would happen in mid 1977. Also inducted that night outside of Amato and Bonventre was Johnny Skyway Palazzola and Frank Coppa. Now, Coppa would state that they came and did the initiation ceremony in duos and that he and Skyway were a duo and Bonventre and Amato were a duo. Now, upon his initiation into the Bonanno crime family, Cesare Bonventre would be placed into the crew of Salvatore Catalano, which that comes from text from the FBI in 1978. Bonventre was a big moneymaker. He made a lot of money in legitimate business ventures, but his main thoroughfare, which we'll find out, is loan sharking. Now, I also found some pretty interesting information that it was said that Bonventre was a silent partner in up to 15 pizzerias, and that he had all sorts of hands in that realm, and that he was likely very involved in narcotics. He was doing all sorts of things to make money. So everything's working out. He's in a Sicilian crew. I also kind of want to talk a little bit about, before we get into the murder of Carmine Galanti. In fact, let's get into the murder of Galanti. Then we'll get into a little bit more about Bonventre's look. In 1979, it's well documented. Carmine Galanti is slain inside Joe and Mary's restaurant courtyard. That day, Baldo Amato and Bonventre were his bodyguards. However, as we know, they were basically in on it, and they allowed Mr. Galanti as well as two others to be killed. And they knew that by getting down or laying down, they would be elevated in the family, which is exactly what happened. Once Galanti's taken out, a lot of the old Galanti loyalists are chopped down. People like Mike Sabella, Matteo Valvo, those types of guys, these old school people that were under Galanti, they're chopped down. New capos are given their jobs, and one of them is 28-year-old Cesare Bonventre. Now, Bonventre was a flashy-looking guy. If you look at him, he kind of always had a cigarette in his mouth. He wore gold chains. He was always someone who had nicely coiffed hair. His chest was always showing. He dressed well. He really looked like an Italian, a true Italian from Italy. He wasn't flashy. He was flashy, but he wasn't loud. He wasn't boisterous. He was quiet. He really commanded the room. Upon becoming a captain, his crew would include Louis Haha Atanasio, Johnny Green Ferracci, and a Brooklyn-based mobster called Salvatore Mirabile. Now, it must be made clear that Mirabile is probably one of Mr. Bonventre's biggest earners. He would maintain a social club in the area of 2525 West 17th Street in Brooklyn, and on regular occurrences at Mirabile's social club, you would find Bonventre. Here they can be seen at the wedding of a person called Giuseppe Bono. Both Mirabile and Bonventre were said to be big-time loan sharks and big earners. Bonventre would live at this home at 2043 83rd Street in Brooklyn. He would marry a woman called Teresa. That would occur in 1981. My apologies, the wrong address, 2042 83rd Street. Bad writing by me. And like I said, when you look at Bonventre, he had a striking similarity to Sal Vitale. He was just a really respected, feared, kind of mafia prince, if you will. Young guy, late 20s, already a captain, had a long lineage, was a Sicilian, was trusted by Galanti at one point. Now, he had seemingly been trusted by everybody. When you're someone like Phil Rastelli or Joey Massino, obviously, I think you can see that there's up-and-comers that can threaten your leadership, and we'd figure out that would happen. By the early 80s, the family was in control of the Bonanno crime family by Joey Massino. That said, he was kind of on an acting basis for his mentor, Philip Rastelli, who spent most of his life, as far as an adult and later adult, in prison. And that would usher in Big Joey to kind of take over things and become the boss and do what he wanted to do. And we would venture to believe that Massino recognized that people like Mr. Bonventre were up and comers and were major threats. I want to get into Bonventre, though. In early 1984, he would actually be arrested, and he was arrested on loan sharking charges. Also arrested that day were various mobsters, included Anthony T.G. Graziano, who, weirdly enough, in this article is referenced as a member of the Lucchese crime family, which is untrue. We know he was a Bonanno member. Also arrested was Salvatore Scarpa, Pietro Peter Rosa, who would eventually become a government informant, as well as Brooklyn-based Lucchese mobster Angelo Defendis. Also picked up was Frankie Lino, who was charged with making a loan with an interest rate of 346%. Now, when you look into Mr. Bonventre, he was arrested for a wild price as well. He would offer a person $6,000 with an annual interest rate of 260%, and it collected approximately $14,000. So you look at the fact that on just one person, Mr. Bonventre cleared about $8K just on one person in interest. Think about if you have 100 customers, 200 customers, 500 customers, just in loan sharking. That's a ton of money. I'd said it wouldn't matter for Bonventre. The seeds of doubt were already starting to set in for Joey Massino, and Bonventre was a marked man. Now, I am going to get into the murder of Mr. Bonventre, and I'm going to do that first, and then we'll get into why Mr. Bonventre was likely taken out. I think, to me, I think if you've listened to this show and you've listened to people that knew Bonventre or knew of him, I think it's kind of abundantly clear, especially if you know anything about Joey Massino and his treachery back then, as far as to his leadership. Bonventre was taken out in April of 1984, and it was said that during the time that Mr. Massino was on the lam, hiding out in Pennsylvania, certain members of Mr. Bonventre's crew were summoned, including a person called Louis Haha Atanasio, seen on the right. He was also called alongside Massino's brother-in-law, Salvatore Vitale, and they were basically instructed by Massino that Bonventre needed to go and that they were the people that needed to do it. So in April of 1984, Bonventre was summoned to a meeting with Rusty Rastelli. They would pick up Mr. Bonventre and he would sit in the front passenger seat. Driving was Salvatore Vitale, and behind Bonventre was Mr. Atanasio. Now, before they picked him up, Massino made it very clear, quote, "He's a sharp guy. You have to be careful." And it was also stated that if Mr. Bonventre showed up with Baldo Amato to, quote, "kill Baldo too." So they had everything covered, and they were warned, this guy's a tough guy. He's a sharp guy. You better make sure you do this correctly because he ain't some patsy. You know, he's going to fight, which is exactly what happened. While driving and pulling into a garage, Mr. Atanasio would shoot Bonventre. That said, he wouldn't kill him. Mr. Vitale would state, quote, "That's when Cesare started fighting me for the steering wheel. I was holding him back with my right arm. He was trying to put his foot on the gas pedal to crash the car." That said, the fight wouldn't last. And we have to say the fight by Bonventre was quite respectable. It wouldn't matter, though. He was hit again by Atanasio and died seemingly at the scene. The rest of him was put into 55-gallon drums and discarded. Let's get into why Mr. Bonventre may have been whacked. There is one theory that allegedly he was trying to shake down a drug dealer, a person called Antonino Aiello, who has been in prison for about 40 years for selling narcotics. It was said that Aiello may have went to Rastelli to complain. Rostelli ordered Mr. Bonventre to show up and explain himself, and he either never did or disrespected the notion. It's also been said that Massino was upset that certain people, including Bonventre as well as other Sicilians, were not kicking up healthy envelopes to him while in hiding. However, I think the most fervent point in regards to Mr. Bonventre's whacking is the fact that at the time of his death, he was only 33. He had been a captain for 5 years. He was, in all intents and purposes, a mafia prince. And if you're 33 as a captain for 5 years, the thought is for the next 30, 40 years, you're going to have to contend, if you're Massino, with this guy. And he viewed him as very powerful. If you know anything about the Bonanno Crime Family Sicilian faction, at long points in time, they were viewed as separate from the actual Bonanno family. They were that powerful. They had a lot of influence. They'd been around forever. And I think Massino realized that one of the most popular and powerful Sicilians was Cesare Bonventre. As I said, at the time of his death, he was 33 years old. And I do want to get into what would ultimately happen to the people involved in the hit on him. As we know, in 2004, Salvatore Vitale would become a government witness and would tell what exactly happened to Mr. Bonventre. We know that he would go to prison and is living somewhere in America in the witness protection program. Louis Haha Atanasio was eventually given 15 years for his behavior and went to federal prison. Another person involved in this hit, a man called Peter Calabrese, was also given 15 years. Louis Haha's brother, Robert Atanasio, was also involved in discarding Mr. Bonventre. He was given 10 years in federal prison. Bonventre is buried in a cemetery in Suffolk County, Long Island. You may be wondering, whatever happened to Baldo Amato? Well, he's still alive at the age of 73, doing life at the Federal Correctional Institution at Gilmer in West Virginia. What stories he could tell. That said, he never would talk. Amato is, in mob circles, a living legend. It's that simple. When we look back at the life of Cesare Bonventre, it is a short one and only 33 years, but he was a Cosa Nostra mafia member to the core. He's an old school guy, and there's just not men made like him anymore. Losing people like this in the mafia was really detrimental to its fall. I've said that in the 4 years I've been here on YouTube. You can't have people like this go away because eventually the whole system will be corroded by people that don't have the same values as people like Bonventre and Amato. In the end, the weak people like Massino and Vitale will proliferate and ultimately create a cesspool in what the mafia became. You just can't think that once people like this become controlled, what will happen? We know what will happen, and it happened. An interesting person, Bonventre, and I thought it important to do a little bit more of a deep dive. At some point, maybe I'll do one on Baldo Amato as well. I hope you enjoy this video. I thank all of you for the continued support that you all give me here on YouTube, and that's that. Going to move on to the next video and just continue to try to crank out content here on the channel. I'll see you all next time. If you enjoy our video, please hit that like button. And if you have interest, hit that thanks button below the video to contribute to the channel at any time. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.